Hey, what's up? It's Deek, RelaxShacks.com. Thank you for joining me in this Tiny House Summit series. It's a mouthful. I like to call this particular video Yammering Next to a Cactus as I give it a hug. This is going to kind of be a one-take ad-lib video simply because I have a lot of stuff I have to do building and design-wise. I'm my own worst enemy time-wise. But I did want to be a part of this series because I think it's a great educational tool. Seeing as this video is an hour long, I have my coffee here, don't you worry. Deek, just get to the point, and occasionally if I'm hungry I even have food. It's so rude to eat in front of you guys, I apologize. What I want to talk about, first I'll give you a little bit of where I'm coming from, and then we're going to get into recommended research or books that have kind of shaped what I do and that I think would be beneficial to you guys. But aside from that, something people don't often talk about, I want to talk about what not to do in your tiny house build. I've been in this scene for a long time. My blog, RelaxShacks.com, was the 6th ever that had anything to do with tiny houses in the world. So, as people like to say, it's not my first rodeo. I got into tiny houses in the 1980s, 1985 to be precise, when I was a youngin'. Still collected baseball cards, all that stuff, but I was gifted a book called, and here's where I get into it, this is the segue, or the wave, Tiny Houses by Lester Walker. Now, Lester Walker is kind of one of the OG pimps of the tiny house scene. Not really appropriate, but that's the case. He's been there, done that as well, been around for a long time, done a lot of architectural work. Tiny Houses by Lester Walker was one of the first official books, and many others will claim this as well, that was solely based on diminutive or small space and tiny house design. It's a fantastic book, has floor plan layouts, and I can't recommend it highly enough. It does have kind of a high price tag as it's only in hardcover still, I believe, but it is well worth the purchase. As for me, I run, like I said, RelaxShacks.com. I teach hands-on, strictly hands-on tiny house workshops. Have been doing so with my brother Dustin since 2009 because I believe the quickest way to learn is to actually go out there and do it instead of just sitting around and hearing it. I taught workshops as a hired gun for Tumbleweed for about 3 or 4 years as well. I was the first person they picked up after Jay Schaefer was kind of getting overwhelmed with the load of workshops he had to do. I run a YouTube channel, Relax Shacks, spelled out D-O-T.com. We have 320 some odd videos at this point in time on there, which might be able to help you or inspire you in terms of your design. I have released a couple books. Humble Homes, Simple Shacks is one of them. I'll show you right here, just cred-wise, let you know where I'm coming from. Under Real Deal Publishers, they're not Vanity Press or self-published. Not that it really matters in this day and age. I released another one that's very hard to find that was self-published, Quick Camps and Leg Cramps. There were very few issues of that put out. Micro Shelters is my new book, which is quite a thick one, full color, available through Story Press, and right now I'm currently working on a follow-up to Micro Shelters because it's done so well, thank you. I don't even know what the title will be as of yet, but through Story Press yet again. Aside from that, I do a lot of freelance building for people, not only tiny houses, but backyard structures, tree houses, hobby shacks, cabins. I'm a big fan, honestly, of vacation cabins because they're affordable to build. They can be really funky, circumvent some codes in some cases, depending on where you are. But vacation cabins or weekender cabins aren't a far step from full-out tiny houses. A lot of people fail to realize that because with a lot of these, you can simply plug in insulation, you add facilities, things that you can do in any other shell, and voila, you have a tiny house. Book recommendations, that's enough yammering on me, like I said, next to a cactus. But book recommendations, because one of the things, and this will tie into mistakes people often make when designing a tiny house or outright building one, is to not do enough research. You have no excuse, not to get mean, in this day and age, to not do thorough research. And by the way, as we do this, like I said, it's one take. There might be a doorbell ringing. It's like someone delivering Amazon packages, or the phone's going to ring, or my butler Jeeves will come in to refresh my coffee. No. But anyways, one thing people often don't do, and I see this all the time, they become enamored with the whole tiny house craze and the notion of downsizing because they just saw some whatever flash-in-the-pan hit TV show where they built a house in 2 days, which usually doesn't happen. In fact, it never happens. So they go out, buy some stock plans, don't alter them to suit their own needs, and just crank out or crap out a tiny house. Problem is, what happens, and I see this over and over, those people later, when they see all the other tiny houses in the scene and how they were crafted, spatially arranged, they become remorseful in that their house was so slapdash and hastily put together. They really didn't plan it to suit their own needs. And had they taken more time to do so, their house might look like some of the really cool other ones out there that have some of the transforming furniture, better arrangement of space, and just a better overall layout and or look. So please do not rush your build. That would be tip number one of like 5,000 here. I talk about a lot of this stuff as well as the advantages of going tiny, or at least downsizing, like ammunition for your, dinners with Uncle Larry, who is the naysayer. I talk about all this stuff in Micro Shelters, my book Micro Shelters, but this is kind of an expanded version because I wrote Micro Shelters a couple of years ago, and since then I've kind of seen a lot more things that people are doing incorrectly. I have my cheat sheet here because, like I said, this is a long discussion. But book-wise, real quick, Lloyd Kahn's book, Tiny Home, Simple Shelter, one of my early cabins or tiny houses I built in 2001 is featured in here. And that's not the reason I'm recommending this. This is like a coffee table style book. Some of the negative reviewers will say it doesn't tell me how to, A, B, C, D, build a tiny house. No book will tell you that. But it shows you a lot of photographic inspiration. There's a lot to be drawn from this book. If you've seen this, and I don't mean to be judgmental, but if you've seen this and you haven't been inspired or learned something in one way, shape, form, or another, you are dead from the neck up. That was harsh. It's a very fantastic book. A lot of other good ones out there. David Stiles and Jeannie Stiles, Rustic Retreats is one of my favorites. On RelaxShacks.com, I have like my top 10. Dan Price put out a book that's part graphic novel, part journal called Radical Simplicity. Loved that book. It was very inspiring to me. Sunset put out a cabins, I think it was like Cabins and Vacation Houses, a book in the 70s. I like the Sunset series, a lot of their books, very informative. That one's pretty cool. It really runs the gamut between tiny seasonal houses and full out, tiny houses and slightly larger houses, but there's a lot of ideas to be had. Don't let a book that's called Cabins, Vacation Cabins, small houses, deter you and keep you from gleaning information. I see this a lot on YouTube. People will watch videos and plug their ears once they see that a cabin isn't insulated or doesn't have a bidet and refuse to take any information from the rest of the video. Don't be that person. Every video, good or bad, every tour, every book, there is something to be learned from that. So usurp all the knowledge and inspiration you can before you build. In terms of other books, I'm trying to think real quick here. Dan Luche, a lot of people ask me, I'm building on a trailer. Dan Luche, he's from Georgia or Florida. It's criminal that I don't know this off the top of my head. Sorry, Dan. But Dan Luche, not only a really good dude, his book on tiny house design and building in a trailer is, just look up his name, it's Louche, is, I think, the best out there in terms of step-by-step, concise instructions on retrofitting a trailer or building on a trailer. There are a lot of other fantastic books out there. I'm not meaning to slight anyone. Some very fun ones and inspiring too, like D. Williams, The Big Tiny. Let's see what else. My all-time favorite, not so much a tiny house book, but based on thrift, living off the land, and just simple living. Not Thoreau. He doesn't even make the top 10. I know it's sacrilege. Is Shanty Boat by Harlan Hubbard. I've read that book 3 times. It's awesome. Into the tips as I sip some coffee. Because the best part of waking up is 7 cups of coffee in your cup. Level it daily. So a lot of the workshops I do, hands-on workshops, I'm going to do these all around the U.S. and beyond. One of the things I will beat into people's heads, because most people, let's face it, are more so interested, be it from TV shows, websites, or the more viral online internet scene, are tiny houses on wheels, which have their advantage and their disadvantage. But if you're building on wheels, level that trailer daily. I'm going to back up and start zooming into the camera, moving into it one more time to really, really emphasize this. Level that trailer daily. Reason being, here's what happens. You're building a trailer, be it on a driveway, and there's another tip right there. Build in the most level place to start with you can find and stable, a driveway, not like a quicksand bog, for instance. People overlook this or build on a terrible slope. Find a great building site indoors if you can, even better. What happens though is people start building, and as you're walking around on this trailer, and your linebacker friends are doing so, that trailer that was leveled to start with soon gets out of level, even just a little bit. Now, people also don't factor in that if you're leveling it with blocks, shims, it happens to rain, that wood expands, or it's hot out and dry, it contracts and shrinks. That will make a sizable difference, up to, you know, a quarter of an inch in some cases, just on shrinkage, with your trailer being level. So you forget to level trailer from day 1 to day 2, and all of a sudden it's day 7. You realize, you know what, let me slap a level on this build once again. You find out that your trailer is in fact not so level. But all the while, based on what you thought was a level platform, you've been putting up, standing up your walls, and hitting them with that 4-foot level or longer to make sure they're plumb. Previously they were plumb, that is, straight up and down. But what happens is you were building off a structure that wasn't level. So now when you re-level, here's your walls that are all plumb, here's your unlevel structure. Now once you level that trailer out, those walls that were plumb straight up and down now no longer are. You are now faced with the problem of going back and racking or turnbuckling those walls, fighting them back into place, which isn't so easy and oftentimes doesn't work or happen. Or you just push forward and are faced with the challenge of cutting the world's longest pieces of flaring trim to hide the exponential mistakes that will come from you not leveling that trailer daily. Am I getting through to you? This may be unprofound to some of you, but it's amazing how many people forget to do that and how many problems ensue from you not doing that. This brings me also, as I talk about that, to using a proper level. Torpedo levels, shorter levels, and step building, you know, in laying foundations, setting strings for digging and pouring concrete. They have their time and place. When building, make sure you have a 4-foot level, not a 2-footer, because you're going to be checking the plumb and levelness of many long runs in your trailer. Say your trailer's 16, now some of them are like 82 feet long. It's getting kind of crazy. The giant cigar tiny house, it's like a big missile with all ill-put windows laid out on its side. No judgment there. But you want to level this at least 4 feet, because 4 feet will average out a board which has its natural curves and eccentricities. So you want to take a 4-foot level to average those out, and it's much more accurate. 2-foot level, not going to really do the job. Smaller levels, you're kind of screwed. 6-foot level, that's fine, but the only problem with the bigger ones is sometimes it's tougher to fit them into certain crevices, spaces, and areas of your build. It is challenging to build a tiny house. People think because it's smaller, it's going to take me less time. It still has all the core ingredients of a house, be it heating, plumbing, but all in smaller spaces which are harder to access. So don't think as well that your tiny house is going to take about 2 weeks to build. Not going to happen, especially if you've built before. So be reasonable with your time. It's another mistake right there. People often plot out and are very rigid in their planning and not flexible. That my house will take X amount of money and days to build. Do plan in and factor in mistakes. They're going to happen. The weather's going to be terrible. You're going to get sick. You're going to be tired. There's a whole other host of hurdles in the way. But just realize that things are going to happen. Be flexible. Don't beat yourself up when things go awry. So don't use a short level. When it comes, and I can jump around here quite a bit, venting as I rehydrate with coffee. Venting. A lot of people, and Ella Jenkins was so bold as to post a couple blog posts online about her house, the roof of which was improperly vented. She used sheep's wool. There was no venting in the roof. There was no ridge vent, I believe, no cross current of air to take the heat away, to keep it cool. What happened was a lot of stachybotrys, black mold, grew in her roof, which is a nightmare to clean out. It's unhealthy as well. She had to tear her whole roof out, a tear-inducing process, and start from scratch as she pulled all the insulation out and reclad her rafters. A lot of people fail to properly ventilate their home. Heating a tiny house isn't so much the problem, because a tiny house per cubic volume is very small, so you could use one of those tiny NV heaters, a Dickinson boat stove. We joke that you could just burp or fart and heat a tiny house, or you could heat it with a birthday cake, as they say. Almost true. I built many structures. One of my main cabins in Vermont Vermont, mind you, near the Canadian border, has no insulation and simply a metal roof, just to keep the elements and the mice, in theory, out. I have a wood stove in there. We've stayed there in the dead of winter. You can roast that place out. Inefficient, but it works. But ventilation is the problem in small spaces per cubic volume once again, because anytime you exhale, boil water, take a hot shower, the combustion process from propane all produces moisture in the air. And in a small space, that moisture accumulates very quickly. If it doesn't have a place to go, you are up a certain creek without a paddle, as I say, while trying to keep this PC and not use any curse words. So what you want to do is build in both some passive and active ventilation. You can build in systems that sense moisture in the air that turn on automatically, or just be mindful that when you're cooking pasta, maybe for starters have a hood over your range to take all that moisture out and blow it outside. But when you're doing things like that, at least crack open a window or two. Or if you're running your heat full blast all the time, and this sounds ridiculous, but leave your window cracked. You want that exchange of fresh air, you want that ventilation, or you soon will have problems, especially if your insulation wasn't installed as tightly as it could be. There's also something called sick house syndrome. I was a home inspector in Massachusetts for many, many years, and I saw this a couple times. People tend to seal their houses too tightly. There's no exchange of fresh, healthy, natural air in the living space, and that causes, again, many problems as well, black mold being paramount in those risks. So make sure your house is properly ventilated. And going back a little ways, rewind. The most important one, level that trailer daily. Venting, let's see, windows. And this ties in, this is kind of the segue. This is just an aesthetic design. I've seen a lot of rushed. People seem to pride themselves on, I built my tiny house in 3.5 days without any help, in a snowstorm. Stupid. Don't rush your build, like I said. But design and placement. I see a lot of houses you could tell were built by inexperienced people, were rushed out, mainly because the window placement is terrible. Like absolutely awful in these houses. I'm seeing a lot more lunchbox shaped houses with none of the gables, curves, or sexy, aesthetically pleasing and interesting lines some of the tiny houses of old used to have. Some of those are awesome too, and I understand because you want to increase your headroom inside the house. But windows, make sure you properly and painstakingly, I guess, plot out how your tiny house is going to look and where the windows will be placed. I do understand that tiny housing, the whole scene is kind of rooted in thrift. So some people would take a window, and I do this too. You'll take a window you might have procured for free and kind of let the materials dictate the design. But what I often see is bad window placement in relation to your environment, where you're located, your setting, your scene, and how the house is oriented. Let's say you live somewhere cold. You want to face some of those bigger windows. If you're a ground-bound tiny house, or even if you're parking on wheels, you want to be able to harvest the sun's rays and use good windows too to get that free solar gain. But other factors in terms of the sun's arc in the sky, shading in the summer. Do you want to be under deciduous trees so that you're shaded in the summer and you can harvest sunlight in the winter? Those are more with statically ground-bound homes. But in terms of just say aesthetic sense, again, make sure your tiny house, I was going to say doesn't look like crud, but I see a lot of them where there's these very amateurish design mistakes being made. Windows that cram into the corner of the house so that their trim doubles as the corner trim of the house. That looks terrible. It looks like some, and this is coming from a guy who was infatuated with kids' forts and kind of builds forts and tree houses for a living. It looks terrible. Same goes when people slam a window into a door, but so close to the door that there's no visual breathing space. And that trim, again, the door trim doubles as the left or right side trim of the window. That is not something you see done in residential houses for a reason. It just looks like that window was shoehorned in there without proper planning. Tiny houses, yours, to a certain extent, is going to represent the scene as a whole. This is a house that people who haven't seen tiny houses before, this may be their first glimpse into a real tiny house. You don't want that impression to be one that isn't so favorable, because a lot of people, antagonists or naysayers in the scene, always quote the Hooverville shacks. They worry that a house is going to be parked next to your residential house and bring it down in tax value, and that this house is going to make my neighborhood look bad. Don't be the guy that causes those problems and reaffirms those worries. Too few windows is another problem as well. I see a lot of houses out there, and I know it's tempting if you're living in Alaska to make windows that are about this big, where you can kind of squeak one eyeball between them to see what your neighbors are doing. The gun slit windows, I call them. You want to make sure you have some windows in your space, not only for light and fresh air and the outward appearance of the house, or solar gain. There's a ton of reasons, in fact, or egress. If your windows are too small and the house is on fire, you can't get out. But you want to make sure your windows aren't too small and that there aren't too few of them, for not only those reasons, but just visually for space. And we'll get into that in a second. There's so many things I want to talk about here, so the brain is kind of churning, grinding, smoke coming out of my ears. Visible space. You're inside a tiny house. If you have these gun slit windows or none of them, that tiny house, which if you're abiding by the Department of Transportation rules on the road, is 8'6" and no taller than 13'6". So visually you're already encumbered or restrained by how big your house is ever going to look. Now if you don't put enough windows in there, it's going to look like some New Orleans shotgun shack meets a prison cell, because you need visual outward space. You're standing in a house, if it has a big old window, you will see the difference readily or immediately. Your view thereby is able to, as you stand in the house, to extend beyond those prison-like walls, through that window and out into the landscape, almost tricking your mind into thinking that this space is bigger than it really is. Extended lines of sight is what it's called. And for that same reason, I urge people, and this is like tip number God knows what in this video so far, I urge people not to build too many divisional walls in their house. It's not a traditional house. You don't have to divide every single space. The kitchen can bleed into the living room, into the dining room. All those can be combined. So be sure you don't chop up your space too much, or it will feel like some science lab rat maze. I've been in many houses that are chopped up and you're passing through too many doorways, this labyrinth-like crypt. Not that I pass through doorways like that, like I'm swimming through the air, but make sure that's something you keep in mind. Visual space is hugely important. Now for the exterior of the house, once again, the door. Let's talk about the door as your entranceway. And I got a few tips on this right now. Your entranceway, the doorway. Now, first I want to ask you, does your door really have to be on the end of the house, which is kind of predictable? There are a lot of houses out there. I'm trying to think of some off the top of my head. I think Tammy Strobel's from Rowdy Kittens. Bill Rockhill, Bear Creek Carpentry, has done some of these. Myself and Dustin, Relax Shacks, we've done a few. When building that trailer, I think it kind of looks nice and brings a different presentation when the door is on the side of the house. Furthermore, in a world of dual purposing, be it furniture that turns into something else, another Lester Walker coined term, but your doorway, if you use wider doors, French doors, sliders, let's say, on the side of the house, if you're building that side wall properly so there's no racking, but those doors double as windows, thereby, in some cases, giving you a better view, more visual space, egress, greater egress, and not requiring you to install as many other windows. So there's a plus right there. But doors, do they have to be on the front or end of the trailer? Could they be on the side? To give yourself, your house, not so much a two-dimensional billboard look, because like I said, there's a lot of giant lunchbox houses right now, as I call them. But is it worth it to sacrifice even just a foot of space to recess that door just a tiny bit? We did a build at the Los Angeles workshop, recently a hands-on workshop we did, and the structure when I was sketching out was very two-dimensional. It was shipping container inspired but built out of wood, had to be built in 2 days, had to be affordable. We're going to have plan sets for it down the road. But I sacrificed a little space at the entrance just to make not a porch that was usable, but just to change up the face of the house. You don't want this boring, Green Monster in Fenway Park or Berlin Wall look front of your house. But getting onto the doors, I'm continuing. If you put your doors on either end of the house, one mistake I often see, and I think this was done in one one of the Portland tiny house villages and a couple other places. I really see it all the time. Your door on the travel end of the trailer. What I mean by that is the tongue end. As you're traveling at breakneck speeds, hopefully not, down the road, keep this in mind. Your windows, you can shutter those easily enough. They're smaller, and they're more so built to withstand winds, rain. They're properly flashed and overlapped to drain water away. Your door, however, really isn't. Most doors are installed over overhang areas, to sound redundant there. And if you have your door on the travel end of the trailer, as you're driving down the road, creating your own headwind at whatever speed you're traveling, 55 miles an hour, let's say, and wind is coming at you the other way, increasing that wind speed, beating on your house, that door is a place where when it's raining, water is going to travel, collect against that pocket of the door, and force its way through the cracks into your house. That's not something you want. Of course, the first thing to try to do is never travel when it's raining. Sometimes you can't help that, but try to plan accordingly with your travel. There's also another tip that some people use. I know this was something that David Stiles in Rustic Retreats and a bunch of his, like 20 of his other books he talks about. It's something we do as well. It's not a conventional house, so keep in mind your door doesn't have to open inward. In fact, it's advantageous to not have it open inward. And here's why. Coffee sippage. Your door, when it opens inward, actually wastes a lot of swing space. Now that sounds ridiculous by most people's standards, but think about it. That door, if it's 30 inches or so, when it swings in, gobbles up a space that's close to 30 by 30 inches. Not that you're going to sit a chair right there, but in some cases, as you're moving around the house, you might need to position something over there. And then Junior comes to the door, or your neighbor with your mail, or who knows what, someone trying to sell you Girl Scout cookies, opens the door and knocks down whatever. It's wasted space right there. So why not have your door open outward? If you have an overhang, there's not as much the risk of rain getting in there. And furthermore, as winds blow against your house, with proper gasketing and stops on your door, the winds actually help seal your house more effectively. They push the door, closing it against those gaskets, those seals, the trim stops there. But you're also saving space. The door opens outward, doesn't gobble up all that space inside your structure. It's something we do in almost every tiny house we happen to build. With sliders, like I said before, on the side of your house, I was using that example, those are great too. Just don't get overzealous with how big you're making your entryway, because as you keep cutting out voids in the structural strength and rigidity of your tiny house wall, side walls, you're losing strength and have to make up for it with headers and a lot of fairly expensive Simpson ties. The bigger hole you cut with a giant slider, the more prone your house is to racking. Glass is very unforgiving, much like most forms of drywall, so if that house racks at all in high winds, that stress is transferred to the glass eventually cracks. And that's another tip I want to impart in terms of traveling. Tiny House Giant Journey, Jenna and Guillaume, their house is a great example. Vera Struck from Silver Bullet Tiny House. Another one, they have shutters they've built, so when in travel mode, they actually have these hatches that close over the windows. Because as you're traveling down the highway, stones bounce, winds become very strong, and they can pucker in and eventually stress your windows and the glass so much that they crack. That is not a problem you want to have to deal with on the road. Tempered glass is what you want to install as well. Roofing. We're jumping around yet again here. Roofing, one of the most important things of a house. You don't have a roof, you're, again, up that certain creek. Now, when you build your roof, keep it simple. I see so many fancy roofs, and I understand it's the internet age when people want to, without paying their dues, want to achieve viral status from build number one and be on HGTV's Tiny House Giant Budget show, or whatever it's called. So make sure you keep your roof simple. Shed style roofs, one pitch roofs, I think they look pretty good. They're really easy to construct. They shed rain properly. There's no penetrations usually through the roof, be it chimneys, ghosts in the house, be it chimneys, toilet stacks, any of that kind of stuff. You want to try to avoid that, because anytime you punch a hole through the roof, that's the number one spot where future leaks will occur. But the one pitch roof, simple, cost effective, it works, and leaves a lot of headroom. Instead of that pinch space gable up in your loft if you're building a loft into your tiny house. And that's another thing right there. You'll have to decide that. Do you really need a loft? That remains your choice there. I see a lot of people. Frank Lloyd Wright once had a quote, something to the effect of, you know it's a roof if it leaks. Maybe I have that backwards, but the point being, Frank Lloyd Wright was kind of infamous for putting too many dormers and valleys and changes in different styles into his roof work. His houses, yes, beautiful, but the more you add in terms of complications, dormers and valleys where two dormers, or roof pitches meet, the more prone you are and the greater chance there is down the road of you having leaks and huge problems with your roof. And what happens is very tricky. When your house starts leaking, that water will travel down the path usually of least resistance, but once it hits a vertical run, it can jog over a couple feet before it then continues south again. And sometimes it's really tough to pinpoint where your leak's coming from. I did home inspections for years, and anytime people had these valleys where snow dams would build up or rain, think about it, rain is channeled and it's receiving more traffic here than the sides of this roof. That's the spot where your roofing's either going to wear out sooner if it's asphalt or architectural shingles, or where the leak's going to occur. You're traveling that much more volume of water in that one tiny little space. So keep the roof simple. I will add, though, in gable style lofts, the vernacular design, the box with a triangle atop it, in those style roofs, dormers are very advantageous. They make a lot of sense. You look at some of the old, for instance, tumbleweed tiny house designs, where they have just the gable with no dormers, and they've discontinued that long ago. It's like you're slipping into the crypt of doom when you go to bed. And some of those old designs, not only from them, really didn't have any egress either. So by adding dormers and popping out the sides of the walls, you now have egress, fresh air, natural light, and just a much more cheery and usable space instead of, like I said, crisscrossing your body up and running full speed just to get into your loft to go to sleep. Egress, and I'm going to add that one here as another hugely important thing. Egress just means your ability to get out of a tiny house if it's on fire or other things are occurring. A burglar's downstairs and you have to creep out some other way. Probably not going to happen. They might just steal your whole house. So yeah, chain down your house or park the tongue against a wall. Side tip. But egress important. I think it's 5.7 square feet of an opening, a window, is required for fireman access, egress, for them to get in to get you out. Up in your loft, I see a lot of them where people are like, I'm going to save wall space so I can hang up my Cheryl Tiegs posters, my Iron Maiden posters, and whatever else. Make sure you have a window or two on either end for cross breeze. Your loft is the hottest place in your tiny house. It will be excruciatingly hot, a sweat box even. So make sure you have that ventilation, and this is something I keep harping on, but also windows that are big enough for egress. So if there's trouble, you can get out of that tiny house. Never mind the view, which you do want, the natural light, the solar gain, the ventilation. There's so many great reasons to do this. So I might add a skylight. Now, before I was talking about not penetrating your roof where possible, because yes, every time you do, if not flash them properly, even if flashed properly where you've cut that opening, that's the number one spot where down the road you have more of a chance of getting a leak. But with skylights, it might be well worth the trade-off. Think about it. Skylights, natural light. If they open, ventilation. If you have to get the heck out of there, even if they don't open, you could just wrap your fist in a blanket and punch through them, knock a brick through them. You have egress onto your roof where you only have to drop or jump about 8.6 or 10 feet to the ground. You might get hurt, but you're not burning alive. And beyond that, one thing people don't keep in mind, skylights, because I've probably spent the night in close to like 60 tiny houses on my book tour, through my YouTube travels, tree houses, houseboats, whatever, a lot of small spaces. I'm addicted and I will continue to do it. But one thing I love is when staying in a tiny house. Hannah Crabtree, for instance, her maiden mansion in Seattle, great example. As you sit there sleeping at night, there was a skylight right over my head, and you could see, or in the morning, the wind pushing the boughs of the trees back and forth, this mesmerizing, relaxing view right over your head. On the other hand, if you're sleeping in inclement weather, let's say there's a rainstorm, there's nothing more satisfying than having this visual reminder of how lucky you are to have shelter. You're sitting there in this horrible weather or a snowstorm, it's pouring rain, and mere inches or a foot away from your face is the skylight where the weather is just beating upon it but can't get to you. But you have this first row view of the cascading water on the skylight. So it is aesthetically, I would say, advantageous again, or just a good idea to potentially build a skylight into your structure. I wouldn't go crazy and put like 20 of them in there, but they do help. And if they're ones that do open, like I said, hot air rises, your loft gets hot. Even gable windows when lower placed don't vent as effectively as a skylight situated higher on a roof would. Insulation. Well, actually, we're talking about trailers before. Like I said, level the trailer daily. Cheating out on a trailer. My buddy Sage Radachowski, he was so candid to say that when he built his tiny gypsy wagon, it's one of my more viewed videos on the RelaxShacks.com YouTube channel, he regrets cantilevering and cheating out the trailer. For example, 16-foot trailer, it's designed, most of them, to carry a certain kind of load in a certain way and balanced a certain way, 60-40. So by changing the dynamics or the load that's bearing upon the trailer by building it out 2 extra feet on either side, you're messing with a lot of forces. One of which is just as this thing goes down the road and you hit a bump or drags or weights to one side, you could actually be dragging part of your house on the road. You're really creating imbalance in the structure and kind of beating upon or overworking your trailer, so don't do that. Trailers too, like when the tiny house scene first started out, people were just retrofitting utility trailers, which still works. It's a little bit of work. But real quick, there are kind of a bunch of trailers you usually don't want to build upon. Dovetail trailers, which are the ones that have the built-in slope for loading heavy machinery. You can use them, but they require a lot of retrofitting to kind of shim up and build them, the end of them at least, into a level structure where thereupon you start building your structure. But I also see a lot of people online, some of the online boards, tiny house people, oh, I'm so excited, I found this fantastic trailer on sale through Harbor Freight for only $150. It folds in half, you assemble it with an Allen wrench in just 30 minutes. Don't ever build on those, for the love of God. We don't want to read about you in the newspaper. It's the last thing that the tiny house scene needs. 40-car pileup from tiny house that tips over or blows apart in wind on highway. Same with boat trailers, the cradle-style ones. Those are designed to carry loads in a different way. I see a lot of people taking those. I'll cut off the cradle, weld in a couple things, duct tape some 2x4s to it. I'm good to go. You're not. If you buy a used trailer, make sure you know what you're doing, or if you don't, have someone who's into metalworking look it over for spots where it might need repair. Different for the leaf springs and some of the smaller trailers. Just make sure stuff isn't corroding, about to fall apart. It has the proper tires. The axles are rated for the proper weight. There are chapters and many videos on this sort of thing that I recommend you look into. So don't cheat out in the trailer, and don't buy a cheap trailer. I'm into the tiny house movement. I love it because of affordability. And I build mainly with salvage and recycled materials. And that's a whole other video right there. And it's some of the stuff we teach at our workshops. But one thing I do tend to recommend is, and I state it like this, if you're going to spend a ton of money and time building a beautiful house for you that suits your needs, do you want to cheap out and build it on a foundation made out of saltine crackers? I recommend spending the money, as painful as it is, because some of these trailers are 6 G's or more, and buying a good trailer, but one that's also specifically designed for tiny houses. It has the underlayment, thereby saving you 3.5 inches of building, where you can screw your plywood with self-tapping screws, your subfloor right to the trailer. It has little cells or pockets beneath there we can pump in or lay in your foam board insulation. You save space, you save time, you save height on it, 3.5 inches, like I said, which gives you an extra 3.5 inches in your loft. It matters. But I recommend really looking into some of those pre-built trailers. It's painful before you ever get to nail a stick of wood together, or if using metal framing, but it's painful to pay that money. But this is your home, so I recommend you do it right and level the trailer daily. There's a lot I want to talk to, but there's only so much time. Laying out plumbing, utilities, all that kind of stuff. Electrical work, It's another thing I recommend maybe hiring someone to do. I've done a ton of electrical work myself. I'm not a licensed electrician. I would never do it in someone else's house, just the risk involved. It's dangerous. It's not like horseshoes or hand grenades where close enough counts. You get anything wrong, you could burn your house down, get a nasty shock, or even worse, end up dead. So you can run your wiring before it's ever connected to anything, to a certain extent to save money, to have a real deal electrician come in to check it over and do the rest of the work, or maybe just hire an electrician to do all of it. But when it comes to plumbing, and now plumbing's a lot easier with the advent of SharkBite, plug and play, tinker toy-like fixtures, and PEX plumbing with the crimping tools. But plumbing is something, when you lay out your plumbing, like I said, first and foremost, draw a zillion plans of what your tiny house should be and really mess with it to make sure it works spatially, efficiently. But it's a good idea to try to back up, to save money and time, your plumbing systems. What I mean by that is, if you have a bathroom, have it sharing a wall with the kitchen. This way you're only running from there and stemming out a few different short runs of plumbing, instead of having a kitchen being piped to and then having to run your plumbing all the way down and hiding it in whatever way, or drilling through the studs, hiding it all the way, running it all the way down to the other side of your house. It's kind of a waste. And is it necessary? Can you get away with having your kitchen back up to your bathroom? Furthermore, the sink in your kitchen, if it's like 2 feet away from the bathroom, can you just use that as the bathroom sink? Do you need a separate bathroom sink? So a lot of dual use technology or ideas, theory in tiny houses. So make sure you think about that. That's an unprofound idea yet again. It's been talked about in many videos and it's done in many houses. But a lot of people fail to do that in their house and create more work for themselves than need be. Site orientation, we talked about not taking the time to plan electrical work. Now we talk about plumbing runs and electrical work in terms of hiring your electrician. But even if you are hiring someone or doing it yourself, that's another thing. Take the time. Get some graph paper. Look at your house, perhaps you're currently living in right now, and where are the switches located? I live in a very small, very old house which has very few switches or outlets. I've had to add quite a few. We still have rooms with pull string lights. That is a terrible pain in the butt. These days, most outlets are 6 feet apart from each other in newer residential design, buildings, architecture. So what you want to do is figure out what you're going to be using. I'm going to have a toaster oven. I'm going to have, a refrigerator. And you're also going to plan how these can be powered. Propane, RV style. Is it going to be solar? Am I hooking up, umbilical cord style, tapping off some other house? Whatever the case, make sure you determine for efficient usage where your different appliances will be. Or where do I sit often where I might want to plug in my laptop as I'm working on it. If I'm sitting in one corner of the house, my outlet's 14 feet away, that's not going to work so well. In my kitchen, where are those appliances? My coffee maker, my Ron Popeil rotisserie chicken cooker, or whatever gadget doodad he's come up with these days, where's that going to sit? You don't want to have this octopus tangle of plugs running around, dangling through your kitchen sink to go across to the other side of your galley-style kitchen or counters to plug into. It's going to look like a mess. It's not safe. GFCI outlets as well. That's something, it's a must near water in your tiny house. And let's face it, your tiny house is probably going to be so small that GFCIs, you're going to need a lot of them, because your living room might be within 6 or whatever odd feet of your bathroom of running water. So again, let the electrician do a lot of that pro work. It's going to be something, a situation where at night when you go to sleep, you're not going to be worrying like, was it a reverse wiring, a hot neutral reverse? Did I screw this and that up? Is my house going to burn down? Do I smell something burning? It's something that plagues the mind of many who do their own electrical work. I've thought about that before as well. We talk about dividing up a space too much. This is just aesthetic design as well. Leave a lot of visual open space. I'm going to reiterate that because it's so important. Look at any of the nicest tiny houses or the most viral ones out there. The house from Macy Miller, Andrew Morrison and Gabriella, again, Hannah Crabtree, Michelle Boyle, any of those houses, the ones that get the most traffic. Why? Well, one of the things is they don't seem so small, and that's because they've left a lot of open visual space. It's very important. You're dealing with small spaces here. Have enough windows. Predict your flow of traffic, your natural bodily movements through the house. Is it cumbersome to have to bob and weave through the house and duck under things? So make sure that's taken into account. That also plays into storage. I see a lot of houses where people, you can tell that they love the idea of tiny housing, but just aren't really ready for it yet. They haven't downsized, gotten rid of their possessions, nor are they willing to in some cases. So they build in a crud load of storage in their tiny house. By doing so, they still have too much stuff, which is a lot of weight if on wheels in a tiny house, and they've overbuilt for storage. What I mean is that there are little nooks, cabinets, rolling coffee tables that open, and all this junk everywhere. And your house, instead of having this open space, free and clear, breathable look, is very claustrophobic, like this little hobbit den of, it's like Sanford and Son meets the Hobbits. That's not what you want. There's a great example of hidden storage in a video I did. It's a house in Portland. It's called the Alberta Modern Tiny House. You can look it up online. They have some great storage up high, out of the way, because higher spaces around the perimeter of your ceilings tend to be out of eyesight. You kind of forget they're there. So it's a great idea. That must be the president right now. Build more tiny houses. Tell them about tiny houses. Too many transforming things. Onward with tiny house mistakes or things to consider. There are, in the era of, and I'm not dumping on it because all the tiny house TV shows, my brother Dustin and I hosted one for HGTV for a while, Tiny House Builders. In the era of tiny house TV shows, keep in mind it's TV. They have to wow you and outdo themselves at every turn to hold your attention span. They call it the MTV generation attention span. Everything's boom, bang, bing, bop, boom. Just quick cuts on everything. So kind of keep in mind that a lot of houses you see, they force some of those transformative or dual purpose designs on the people. They need that cool bell and whistle or 13 to make that TV show interesting, to hold your attention. So to a certain degree, that's not the real world. You don't need a bed that, on Michael J. Fox hovercraft technology descends from the ceiling with the push of a button. You don't need like a bidet that transforms into a punch bowl and then a Ferris wheel and a dreidel. I don't know how any of those would work. But the reason is, there's an old saying, an old adage, a proverb, that any transforming piece of furniture, and these have been around since the era, like Ben Franklin invented quite a few transforming pieces of furniture. It's been around forever, space-saving technology, turniture. But any object or furniture that requires more than one movement to transform it, over time will not be used, because people generally are very efficient beings and have a low tolerance for patience and don't want to, pull the little lever, then flick the flux capacitor, then adjust the dial, then this and that before a chair turns into a daybed. So don't get too carried away with transforming stuff. Also, anything that moves is bound to break and wear out over time. So your stuff that's all hinged and has all the different gaskets and pistons and Lorax-like horns, keep in mind that stuff's going to break over time. If it moves, it's usually less durable. I'm not slamming the turniture and all the transforming things. I think they're actually great, a lot of them. But don't. There's a house, I think Kirsten Dirksen on her channel featured, and you've probably seen it went viral. It's like this Japanese house that everything comes out of drawers and folds out, and you push a button and a glass of water comes from the ceiling. That house would be the biggest pain in the butt ever to live in reality. It makes for great TV, again, and just keep that in mind. But in the real world, that stuff tires you. You tire of using that and transforming that stuff quickly. Like every time you have to use the bathroom, you have to transform 5 things. It's too late. You've already wet your pants. Screws. Building. I'm a big fan of using screws because you can back them out when you make mistakes. When building on tiny house on wheels, there's a whole set of rules. Not enough time in this video. The screw and glue method is using screws and construction adhesive to doubly ensure that your structure is rigid. You can build in shear panels, use tension ties, hurricane ties, rafter clips. There's a ton of stuff. Again, Dan Luche's book and a bunch of sources online and videos will instruct you on that. But screws I recommend, but I also recommend using star head or square head ones. Long time ago when I was a foolish younger Deek, there's a lot of things I used to do that I'm like kind of embarrassed to say. I used to think one way, now I've matured my years. As I just made a reference earlier about peeing one's pants. Screws are great for holding power, not so much shear strength, but when I use them, because I can back them out, like I said, with mistakes, the star head or the square head ones are less prone to slip when using a bit on them. They drive so much easier. I'd also recommend getting an impact driver. In terms of tools, I have a lot of yard sale tools. Like, to me, a hammer is kind of a hammer. You can get an okay hacksaw, whatever else saw for decent money. You don't have to blow the bank. Certain tools, though, I would spend a little money on. Make sure you get a good chop saw, miter saw, one that's a sliding one perhaps, so you don't have to flip boards they're wider when you make the cuts. That will save you some time and result in neater cuts. An impact driver, though. Right now I use Milwaukee tools, their whole Fuel series cordless, because I do a lot of off-grid building, a lot of treehouse building in addition to tiny house building. They're light enough, they last a long time, they have a lot of power, but the impact drivers, based on the way they're designed, they almost reverse and hammer forward. They make that Woody Woodpecker sound. You've probably heard it, like as you drive something in. Those will save your arm, and they have the ability to drive in the longest of lag screws with ease. So that's something you might want to invest in, not a cheapo Harbor Freight little drill set. Those things, I bought one once upon a time, it lasted, and I swear, like 30 days and just burnt out and died. So you get what you pay for. That would be a tool I recommend. Like I said, DeWalt makes some good stuff. Cordless saws too, but I really recommend the Milwaukee Fuel Series impact driver. Build light. All the while, when you're designing your tiny house, don't get carried away. Do you really need 2x6 walls where you're losing interior space, an inch at either side? That does add up. It does make a difference. It also creates more weight, more cost. Do you really need the 50-gallon fish tank? Do you really need the roof that's slate? You have to, there's a fine balance between building strong and building light with your tiny house. So just keep that in mind all along. I know Jen and Guillaume, they were open enough to say that when they built their tiny house with a trailer that was rated for 10,000 pounds, their house was like slightly over 10,000 pounds, and not including the stuff they later put in it, and they themselves being in the house, which adds weight as well. Every time you're driving the highway, you hit a pothole, that downward force as you bounce into the pothole exponentially increases the weight of your trailer too. You go from 10,000 pounds to boom, 12,000. They were fine on their round the country journey, but the whole time we're white knuckling it, had that in the back of the mind, biting nails, we're kind of nervous. You don't want that to be you. So make sure you're buying the proper trailer for weight rating on its axles, you're balancing things correctly. There's videos on all that stuff. But build light. Don't use 2x3s if you're on the road. Those are not strong enough. They're used in sheds and other buildings, and then you can get by with ground-bound structures in some cases. 2x4 construction, make sure you're using all the proper ties and all the banding and all those things that builders recommend these days. But, don't cheap out, but at the same time, don't overbuild. One thing we do sometimes is we put in a subfloor. We'll use higher grade stuff than using that like junk OSB or MDF. The MDF's very heavy. But a lot of people use that chipboard for their subflooring. We use, in a lot of cases, high grade, like cabinet grade birch plywood, or oak or whatever, oak heavy too. But we only have one layer of it. Saves time, saves money, and saves some space. Instead of having to put flooring on it later, tongue and groove that we gun in, let's say you put some tongue and groove oak on there, it omits that time, money, and 3/4 of an inch in height is saved. Sounds stupid yet again, and this is part of, in the book I talk about that micro shelter, some of the space saving, cost saving, budget building techniques. Sounds stupid. 3/4 of an inch is a lot in a tiny house, whereupon you're restricted to 13/6. 13/6 is also counting the height of your trailer, the thickness of your floor, your roof, your rafters, all that stuff. So it starts to add up or add down over time depending on how you are building. So do build light. Volstruck is a company that does metal framing. I know Mike Bedsole from Tiny House Chattanooga, who's a builder I do respect. He uses a lot of that stuff. I'm a dinosaur. I love framing with wood, and at first, I just didn't believe in the stuff. But after visiting Mike's shop once upon a time, the Volstruck stuff, which starts, it's starting to come down in price, that side of building, much like SIP's structurally insulated panels. But the Volstruck metal framing certainly has a lot of advantages. It's lighter in weight and it's stronger. And if you plan accordingly, you can send off your plans, they frame everything for you, and you just bolt it together. So there's a few tips in small space design in terms of safety, tips and things as well not to do, because that's the running theme here. I want to kind of wrap things up by saying, in the tiny house scene now, and some of it's BS, in some cases I see people like, I didn't use an ounce of help for anything in my tiny house. And then you see in their blog photos there's like a contractor behind them pouring concrete or doing whatever. Don't be that person. I use help all the time. I have a lot of back injuries because I didn't ask for help early on. So now it makes a lot of sense for me to ask for help, but I just should have been doing it all along. There's no shame in having someone else help you. Don't be too proud. Don't be a fool. Ask for help. It's easy. There are a lot of people who might want to learn and not make the mistakes in your project, but learn hands-on through your project and are more than willing to help you for nothing if you just put the word out there. Don't be a fool. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You don't have to build this all by yourself. You could get hurt. You could make mistakes. It will take you so much longer if you do it solo. In the end run, what does it really matter? Well, I want to brag it all myself because it's more article friendly. I might be more prone to be written up in the New York Times or whatever. Who cares? Be safe. Safety is huge. Don't rush these builds. Take your time. They will take 3 times longer than you think. And realize that as well. When building alone, though, I think it's Jim Carroll about tips and tricks when building alone. Check that book out. I'm mentioning it right now, which reminds myself I'm going to go and buy that book because I'm sure there's a ton of things I'm doing wrong or could be doing more efficiently. But one thing, and this is from a guy who's gotten hurt many times and fallen off roofs and all sorts of stupid things off-grid in the woods where they'd have to airlift me out of there, and there's no phones or electricity if I got hurt. Cell phone. If you're in an area that has cell phone signal, sometimes I'm not, have a cell phone on you. If you're doing something especially dangerous, have it by you, and some people say dial 911 so that if you fall and get especially hurt, all you have to do is hit one more button and scream for help. I've fallen and I can't get up. Your life alert little band right there. So make sure you have a cell phone with you, because if you get hurt, you're bleeding to death, at least you have that chance of getting help on its way ASAP. So that kind of wraps things up in terms of what not to do. There's a zillion other things, and I'll just even add right now, there's so many more I could recommend. Like I said, the book has a bunch. These are some that have come off the top of my head and some that I've planned to talk about. But one I will leave you with, because I lied, we're not done yet. It's the coffee. We were just building in Los Angeles at that hands-on tiny house building workshop, and a bunch of people brought these little dinky tape measures from Harbor Freight or wherever, these little cute ones that are like 8 feet long or weird denominations, 8.5. When building a tiny house, get a 25-foot, good, nice, rigid, real deal tape measure. This way, if measuring by yourself, they are strong enough where you can extend the tape, 8, 10 feet in some cases, and it won't flop downward to get those high measurements or across the room. They're better tape measures usually are more accurate, and a lot of the measurements you're going to take when squaring up your structure or across your ridge beam, things like that, are going to be quite long, especially with today's tiny houses where the average isn't 16 or 18 feet, it's more like 24 feet, and now we're seeing some like 32 feet. We saw one that was 500 some odd square feet at the Tiny House Jamboree in Colorado. But you want a good tape measure. Do not be the guy who takes a 12-foot tape measure, measures across, makes a little tick line in the wood, then measures again. There is room for error in that. What you measure will not be KCT, kitchen cabinet type. So be warned. And again, as I depart here, level that trailer daily. Broken record time here, but it's one of the more important and more overlooked tips out there. Again, I'm Derek Diedrichson. Thank you guys for joining me. RelaxShacks.com is my blog. More so what I do now is just the videos on the RelaxShacks.com channel on YouTube. And I hope this series, my video or the rest of them out there, helped you in some way. And best of luck with your future builds. And I hope some of these tips right here will indeed keep you from screwing up on your tiny house build. See ya.